And yet another critical topic in exploring the potential for a more sustainable future, please allow me first now to introduce everyone on stage, beginning with our moderator, closest to me from the stage, Shao Loong, Senior Research Associate, KRI, Malaysia. Now, Shao Loong's work focuses on industrial policy, climate change, and future technologies. He has spent a decade working in federal and state government, and another decade in civil society and academia. Shao Loong, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks.
We also have joining us our esteemed discussants on stage, and this is, of course, in seating order, your left to the right. First and foremost, Professor Dr. Kim Leng, Professor of Economics and Director of Economic Study Program, Jeffrey Cheah Institute Southeast Asia, JSI, Sunway University, Malaysia. Dr. Kim Dong-soo, Senior Research Fellow, Korea Institute for Industrial Economic and Trade, KIET, Korea. Professor Dr. Chua Beng Huat, Professor in Urban Studies, Yale-NUS College and Professor of Sociology at NUS, Singapore. Dr. Sarena Omar, Deputy Director of Research, KRI, Malaysia. Ladies and gentlemen, Shao Loong will be leading this discussion on institutional futures, which focuses on such bigger picture questions. In governing growth, when should the government intervene or retreat from the market? Looking at specific examples from housing, agriculture, and manufacturing sectors. With trade agreements, can the government act with national self-determination and sovereignty to achieve developmental aims? A gentle reminder once again to our audience, Slido is available for all questions from the floor for our discussants. Hashtag is MyFutures2023. Our moderator will be taking the questions towards the end of the session. Shao Loong, that said and done, the stage is all yours.
Thanks, Tamina. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our final session for the day. I hope you tanked up on coffee because we've got a fantastic panel ahead. We've got 4 speakers who are going to delve into a mix of macro as well as sectoral concerns. And we're going to explore the issue of markets and government intervention. Malaysia, like many other countries, has a on and off again ambivalent relationship with markets. Sometimes we create them, sometimes we break them, sometimes we intervene, sometimes we retreat. And so this is one of the fundamental questions that the panel is going to look at. Firstly, when should government intervene or retreat from markets? And secondly, we're going to explore what are the constraints, both external and internal, that governments face when doing so, and how can they overcome them. And so we're going to start off with Professor Kim Leng from Sunway. Please, Professor.
Thank you. Thank you, Shao Loong. I think you're right to say that there's been on and off some kind of hate-love relationship between governments and market in Malaysia. But I will discuss the topic in three broad areas. First, I will look at the evolving role of government and markets in the economy. And then I will touch upon the broad lessons that we can draw from Malaysia's so-called interventionist policies. And then importantly, we can relate to the so-called economic restructuring policies of the government over the decades. And then, of course, the last section, I will look at some possible direction for institutional reforms and envisioning our institutional futures. Now, as you know, Malaysia is a mixed market economy, and one of the key reasons for the so-called heavy intervention in the economy is because of the need to restructure the economy following the so-called new economic policy after the 1969 riots. So that intervention, of course, over the decades, we have seen development thinking change over time. World Bank has advocated initially in the 60s, 70s, getting prices right, and then followed by getting policies right, and then finally maybe now it's getting the institutions right. But I think for the future, we will need to get all of them right at the same time. So I think that's the challenge facing for the panel as well as policymakers. Now, one of the so-called the evolving role is that I think we need to basically understand the strengths and weaknesses of both the government and the markets. And they are very contextual, largely because it depends on the capacity and the capabilities, and also depending on the maturity of markets. So the government will have different roles in different stages of growth of the economy as well as the growth of the markets. Now, key lessons that we can draw upon, we can look at Malaysia's intervention, and I think we cannot paint it with a broad brush, largely because it depends on the economic activities that the government is intervening, you see. Now, you can look at the production, so-called production economy. You'll find that there has been fairly dismal performance on government intervention in terms of setting up government companies, GLCs, and state development bodies and all that. The successes are not, the government failures are more predominant in those, in the case of intervention in the production economy. And a case in point is, of course, the early 80s, Malaysia embarked on a heavy industry import substitution drive, you see, where we had many companies set up to drive the industrialization. And that, I think there are not many, the performance are not really, we can be proud of, but nevertheless, as we evolve over time, what has happened is that market liberalization, we have built up a very strong industrial sector driven largely by FDI, you see. And that, I think, the so-called hands-off policy of the government, letting the market forces work and letting the competitive dynamics operate freely, then you have seen that kind of success in both the primary, tertiary, and secondary activities. But what is notable is that over the years, we have industries that remain sheltered and protected. They have not matured beyond their infant industry stage, you see. And this is where we are caught. So those sectors are typically, like in the advanced economies, typically in the food and agriculture industries. So we have a lot of protectionist policies. Basically, the intervention is largely to support relatively uncompetitive industries in the face of opening up the economy, where imports are relatively much cheaper. And you have that kind of protections, so-called barriers, trade barriers, as well as import barriers in the form of tariffs, in the form of licensing, quota, and all that in place to support those industries, those sheltered industries. So we do have pockets of this kind of industries, but fortunately, they are relatively small in terms of economic significance. So the impact on the economy has been relatively muted, but nevertheless, they have a major implications on the consumption economy, largely because of the subsidies, the protection given by the government. You see. So there is a very heavy subsidy burden on the part of the government. So it becomes unsustainable, unproductive, and all the subsidies, especially consumption subsidies, the intervention in the consumption market has not been really, it's helpful in terms of reducing the inflation as well as the cost of living, but nevertheless, it has led to widespread distortion in the economy, both in the food sector, and I think the other panelists will be talking about it. So that's the kind of, from a consumption economy, the intervention has relatively effective in terms of controlling so-called guarding the economy against inflation and protecting the low-income groups from the ravages of rising inflation. But nevertheless, there is a cost to it. So that intervention, there is so-called, I would say, mixed results. But nevertheless, I think going forward, we need to rationalize the subsidies and then how best we can utilize the subsidy savings to build the other sectors of the economy. I think that's an important drive that the government is now embarking on. The other important part of the so-called, I would say, success story of government intervention, I would say, is actually in the financial markets, the so-called the capital economy. And this is where the government has been relatively successful, given the fact that they have intervened because there were missing markets as well as missing institutions. For example, we don't have a so-called legal framework to issue bonds during the early years of the bond market. development of the debt capital market. You see. So the government came out with a legal and regulatory framework to allow corporations to issue bonds. So we at that time, you do not have a rating agency. So the government played a very important role in creating a bond rating agency. And importantly, 5 years after the first rating agency, because it was then a monopoly, second rating agency was set up. So the lesson learned here is that we must eventually introduce competition, and markets or industry cannot be protected for too long. If not, they will lead to misallocation of resources, market distortions, and all other so-called deficiencies of not relying on market forces. And also, we also find that in the financial markets, various institutions, they are well regulated, and also because of the strong supervision, you find that the contribution of the financial sector has been really significant in terms of contributing to the economy. We have, in fact, after the Asian financial crisis, the restructuring undertaken by the central bank as well as the government has helped the economy to weather two major downturns in the global economy. One is the global financial crisis, and then more recently, the pandemic. So we have been relatively successful in terms of government intervention, leading to a much stronger financial sector. In fact, Malaysia's financial sector is one of the deepest. If you look at various indicators, you'll find that Malaysia's financial indicators are equivalent to advanced markets, advanced economies. But nevertheless, we also need to ensure that it does not result in over-financialization. And this is where the bubbles will happen, and you'll lead to another so-called crisis, a financial crisis. So that's the broad lessons that we learned from over the years, very briefly. Intervention in terms of the role of creating markets, in terms of a catalytic role in starting up industries. Although there are some cases of so-called not so successful intervention in terms of creating a startups, like in the semiconductors, the only company that we have did not really progress further than that, you see. So the lesson is that we should not intervene too much in the production aspect of the economy, you see, but focus our role in strengthening the competitive foundations of the economy, focusing on skills, focusing on lowering the cost of doing business and reducing the regulatory burden. So those are key areas that I think the new institutional futures that we are looking at is to have strengthened the capacity and the capabilities, and then importantly, we build the various institutions that covers both all the different aspects, like including social protection, environment, have an integrated environmental institutions that can handle environment management problems on an integrated basis. So those are very important. And of course, the other aspect is that we need to, in terms of whether we should intervene or withdraw from the market, very important to understand the limits of government and markets, and then importantly, the role, the capacity, and the capability that we need to, both the government and markets need to have a calibration in terms of their ability to create so-called more advanced markets that are more efficient in terms of functioning and in terms of contributing to the productivity and the growth of the economy. Now, in terms of the future going forward, we do see a need to reduce the role of the GLCs. So there's a need to rebalance the role of the government versus the markets, and to focus on the respective strengths of the capabilities that have been built up over the years in each of the institutions, but they have to be subject to market forces, subject to competition, and then that's very important. And then finally, other aspects like continuous upgrading of institutional capabilities and competencies, with a very strong focus on not just having qualified, trained professionals, but also adopting a more multidisciplinary as well as interdisciplinary approach to handling a lot of issues that are so-called involving all various disciplines. So the ability to pool resources together, ability to coordinate and merge all the so-called the brain power from all the various different sectors, those are very important. So the coordinating role of the government or the institutions that are involved that has been tasked to resolve problems in the economy will be very important going forward in terms of having so-called very high quality, so-called world-class kind of institutions that have driven so-called economies that have less resources. Compared to Malaysia, we have abundant resources, but what is lacking perhaps is institutional capabilities now that we need to raise it to a level that can sustain investor confidence and continuous upgrading of the economies. So those are the institutions that we need to build, and of course we do not want to develop that kind of innovative institutions rather than so-called extractive institutions that we see in other regions, especially in the Middle East, where one of the key problems of countries in those regions is that institutions are only extractive, you see. So I think for Malaysia, in closing, we need to focus on creativity and innovative ability to so-called pull together all the resources, because institutions are very broad and vague, ambiguous concept. It covers everything from rules, laws, institution, organization, relationship, and conduct, and all this. So it becomes very hard to pinpoint exactly what should be a good institution, because it covers laws, rules, beliefs, value systems, and all that. So I think that is a very rich topic for our research and for the academia. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. So we've heard the Malaysian case study, and now we turn to Dr. Kim for some insights into South Korea. Please.
Thank you so much for inviting me in this forum, especially Dr. Suraya and Dr. Shin. I'm not quite mature to discuss Malaysian future. So instead, I'm going to share with you the institutions and economic development in Korea. It looks like the graph looks like what we saw this one before. I mean, in the morning session, it's almost identical. The graphs are just Korean economy. The size of Korean economy in year of 2021, we have GDP to $1.8 trillion, GDP per capita about $35,000, something like that. And the growth rate in 2021, it's about slightly over 4%, something like that. But as you can see, there are three different points that we have minus growth. It was 1980, because at that time, the Korean president has been assassinated, and it was a big shot. And late 1997 and 8, we do have the Asian financial crisis, we call IMF era. And in year 2008-9, our growth rate has been down, but still positive. And because of the COVID-19, we do have a minus growth. That's the Korean economic growth path, something like that. And when I studied in US, this is the sort of principle of economics. What makes economy grow? Absolutely, we put input more, then output will be more, something like that. So we just input more labors and capitals, then we will get more output, something like that. Then it doesn't explain all. So then what is left over? Technology. Technology shift our capacity, something like that. Technology, also it is not enough to explain. Then what else? Like Jeffrey Sachs, He just talk about the geography, especially latitude. It's ironically close to the equator area. You have abundant resources, but your economy is no good. Go to the pole side, it's very cold, so people has some kind of incentive to work. Unfortunately, yes, that's true. And J.V. Henderson, he talked about the urbanization. People gathers, then there is a synergy effect. And plus, the primary city, like the capital, normally capital city, what is the optimal size of a capital city? Kuala Lumpur has an optimal population or not? That's important. What about the second largest city? Is it too small or too big? That kind of a city size distribution affects the economy. Yeah, it makes sense. And Ace Magalu, Johnson, and Robinson, they just talk about the colonial origin and economic development, and then they just move to the democracy. Democracy really plays key roles in the economic development or not, and then also dictatorship. They take a look at those kind of things. It was very excited. And these days, actually, 2016 to 2019, for 3 years, I was in Beijing office, and I just observe a lot of Chinese economy. What makes Chinese economy grow? Wow, it's not democracy. It's a communism country. Then how can they just grow fast? A lot of people just talk about the state capitalism. Transparent state capitalism, yeah, it plays a role. I think so. So I don't want to say democracy is better or communism is better, something like that. But in this different, developing stage, we need to have some kind of appropriate institution. I think there is. That's what I want to talk about. And unfortunately, in Korea, 1950 and in between 1950 and 1953, for 3 years, we have a Korean War. Everything has been destroyed. 1960, according to the World Development Indicator, GDP per capita in 1960, less than $100, and now 35,000 US dollars. And what happened in between that? One of the dictator from the military, he took over the presidency in 1961. He had a coup, and he just governed 18 years. After him, another 2 ex-presidents from the military. They just took the presidency another 12 years. So from the 1960 to up until 1992, for 30 years, we do have presidents from the military side. They didn't know about the economy, so they just let the experts like economists and scientists and engineers, let them do that. And then the presidents, the government support very strongly. It worked. It's called a dictatorship or not? I'm not quite sure. Anyway, it was a really good leadership, I think. It was a really good institution, I think. After that, as you can see the bottom, very flat rectangle. There are 2 rectangles. Those are the democratic parties. In between the others, no rectangles, that means conservative parties. Our history, the recent history is very, very dynamic. The political parties take turns, like 10 years term, we take turns. And of course, 2016, we do have a sort of impeachment of president. Even that things happen, but still our economy is not that bad, I think strong. So after the presidency from the military, our democracy has been improved a lot, and then our economy not depends upon the president, only one leader, but depends upon the sort of democratic system, I will say institution here. So even though take turn, the political party take turns the governing power, but still our economy is not that bad. Then I don't want to say failure of the institution. Instead, maybe I will say we are struggling. The most important thing is just our economy is exposed to the global risks. As you know, there are strategic competition between US and China. They just keep asking us to be their partners. And sometimes we call, in the security side, we are lean on the US side. For the economic side, we are just lean on the Chinese side. Because the trade volume with China is more than like a quarter, like almost 25% of our trade with China, something like that. So we are at stake in some sense. Then the most risky thing is our government, sometimes Democratic Party, they just try to close to the China, Conservative Party, they just try to go to the US side. Again, as I introduced, we take turns. I mean, the political party take turns. So sometimes we close to the China, and sometimes we close to the US. But then year 2022, last year, US just established two big law. One is Chips and Science Act. The other one is Inflation Reduction Act. That really, really affects our semiconductor industry, rechargeable batteries, and electric vehicles, things like that. Those sectors are key sectors, but also those sectors are heavily related to the China in the aspect of supply chain. So we need to stabilize the supply chain. So how can we just reduce the sort of expected loss? I mean, sometimes we may just we are in fear of someday China may just cut their supply, something like that. Then again, when it comes to institution, I mean, sometimes I'm very confused. Institution or policy or politics, it's all mingled. But I will say like Korean institutions are relatively sound, but it heavily depends upon the politics. Politicians decide what to do. And then government officers try to realize those kind of policies. So sometimes like energy policies, as you can see, environment policies, or international relation policies, those kind of things are just has been changed, no, or not inconsistent. Maybe if we need to change a little bit, not this way and that way, exactly opposite side. No, that's not that good enough. I mean, that's no good. That's only the, I think we are struggling with some kind of institution issues. Then I'm going to ask myself, what time, I mean, when the Korean government should engage. I mean, in the developing time period, like before the 1990s, public sector led private sectors. So, as a professor in the morning said, like government set up the roadmap, and it worked very well. But after 1990, I think Samsung Electronics, I mean, after 1990s, late 1990s, after the IMF era, our economy has been changed to the more global standardized, something like that. And private sector start to lead public sector. So, for example, R&D expenditure in a public side is smaller than R&D expenditure in Samsung Electronics. So these times, government cannot provide a roadmap at all. Only what government can do is government try to improve our institution. What I mean is institution here is the regulation. Sometimes we need to have a stronger regulation. Sometimes we need to deregulations, something like that. So I think there is a big paradigm shifts in the government's role. It was a very direct support. Nowadays, the government try to provide some more friendly environment, something like that. And here again, the past economic policies, industrial policies, we just selected certain sectors and then support that, develop that, that was it. But these days, industries are related to the international relations, industries are related to economic securities and things like those kind of things. So what government intervene here, engage here is those kind of risks. From those kind of risks, how can we mitigate? How can we just secure those kind of global economic environmental changes, things like. Nowadays, again, the conflicts between U.S. and China, and also like climate changes and digital economies, those kind of things. What we can do is the government, government side engagement. Absolutely, we need those things. Yeah. This is all I have.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Kim. I think we see some interesting parallels with what Prof. Ye also talked about, early intervention, and then institutions playing a more like a referee rulemaking kind of role. I think we turn now to our two sectoral examples, starting off with Professor Chua, please.
What I'm going to say is actually a radically distilled version of what happens in the housing sector in Singapore, all right? So, and about intervention, I mean, in this particular case, Singapore, the PAP government had intervened in the housing sector since the very beginning. So it has never retreated from that, right? And so that, from the very start, there is this notion that Singapore will become a nation of homeowners. So then the question is, this is a fairly tall order in the sense that very few countries actually achieve such a situation. And in Singapore, it's pretty close to universal home ownership, with, of course, not everybody owns the same size houses, but at least everyone has the security of a home. And because there's only about, technically speaking, about 60,000 families that are renting from public housing system. All right, and that means 94% of those above that either owns a private home or a subsidized public housing flat. So this is pretty close to universal provision. So then the question is, I think the most important thing is most of the time, housing is thought of as kind of a use value, so the consumption value, because you need shelter. But housing is also obviously an investment good because you build housing wealth, you build wealth from home ownership. But I want to suggest that in addition to that, one ought to look at housing as a political good. And because every situation, in every country in which if housing is not affordable, or if there's serious housing shortage, those issues gets politicized very, very quickly. So in fact, my suggestion is that every government should really look at housing as a political good. And the tendency is, of course, to provide housing only as a residual welfare provision, which means that the tendency is to provide housing for those who cannot afford their own afford to buy their own in the market. So they are actually given sort of social housing, largely as a rental housing. But the point is to actually, particularly for those who are unable to afford the market prices themselves, to actually provide them not rental housing but home ownership, because the advantages of that is far exceeds rental housing. Because if the poor or the lower income were only provided with rental housing, in a way they will be permanently stuck in that kind of situation. They will have a shelter, but they will have no means of building wealth to actually be able to exit from the welfare provision situation, right? So the idea is to actually, instead of providing rental housing, to encourage ownership of the residential unit they're in. The residential unit, whatever form it takes, depends, of course, on the local conditions as such. So Singapore, being fairly land scarce, all the housing are in high-rise. But high-rise flat is not necessarily the only mode of provision. The important thing is the ownership and not the architectural features of it, right? And so the thing about owning in that case, as I said, is that it allows the lower income groups to actually be able to build wealth and become, to a significant extent, much more self-dependent. So, and ownership also, in that instance, provides a certain dignity to the homeowners themselves, because the rental housing situation, usually rental housing situation is that in most countries, ownership is the norm. So those who are forced to rent usually suffers from certain kind of subjective sense of failure, so to speak. So ownership provides for the family, for the individual and the family, certain kind of human dignity that comes along with it. And in the ability to build wealth, there are a number of sort of positive outcome. One of which is, in fact, politically speaking, the security of home ownership actually arguably enables the owner to actually be able to exercise their political rights and freedom much, in some kind of, in a certain sense, it increased the political equality, because it allowed, the economic security allows them to actually be able to act much more freely in terms of their political rights. So there is a political payoff. And on the other hand, given that housing tends to, obviously investment in housing has its own risks, but the long-term tendency of home ownership is that the housing prices will increase, the building of the wealth will increase, and that therefore housing becomes a stored value asset that could be, that becomes a base for owners to provide for their own welfare in the longer term. So that in fact, it allows the less dependency on the state and therefore allows the state to actually be able to not, and the burden of welfare provision actually potentially is reduced if you have a coordination of homeowners, right? And as I said earlier, the individuals also are able to then be, being not dependent on the government for welfare, is able to actually accrue more freedom for themselves, right? And so, I mean, looking at the Singapore situation, obviously, there is actually great benefit to the PAP party because, in fact, the ability to provide housing for the entire nation is actually symbolically, it's an important symbol, political symbol of the government's efficiency and its efficacy in providing for the nation. And so, and also, you go, when people look at Singapore and look at all this housing provision, right, it is in fact a reflection of the ability of the government. In fact, the PAP government derived not only internationally this sense of achievement, but at home, it actually gains a lot of political capital. It gains a lot of political capital, and it increases its legitimacy. The interesting thing is that with that kind of political capital and legitimacy, it allows actually the government to actually use the housing, to piggyback on the housing policy. A lot of the less acceptable social policies that goes along with it, right? So for example, the government, PAP government is ideologically very pro-family, and they actually built the pro-family policy into eligibility rules, allocation rules for housing. So, so not only is beneficial in the sense to the residents, but also has a huge payoff for the state, for the government, for the incumbent government. So in that sense, I mean, I think if one were to look at Singapore housing system, any government would have no reason not to intervene and no reason not to actually provide, to encourage home ownership at the maximum level. Obviously, no matter how much subsidy in the public sector, in public housing, there will always be a residual population that for very serious personal circumstances, are unable to even buy into the minimum level, first step in the ladder to home ownership. And those obviously are the welfare cases. But in the PAP's government's position, they even work on those and try to sort of cherry pick from that residual population to kind of look at which family with sufficient assistance are able to actually make the move into ownership of the minimum public housing flat, and then hopefully from there to build up. And this is it's actually only possible largely because of the employment situation, because ownership is only possible because it's a long-term investment of mortgage, right? It's only possible if employment is not continuously disrupted. If employment is not steady, and if the household breadwinner is has discontinuous employment, then it becomes really a burden to own. In that case, the flexibility of rent is actually preferred, right? So along with encouraging home ownership, there's a kind of need to continuously work on the employment issue. And on that level, ownership also disciplines labor. So the rapid transformation of Singapore from a highly informal sector economy of the 1950s and early 60s into a highly formalized, disciplined labor is actually highly facilitated by the public housing ownership system. Right? So now owning a public ownership is de facto a right of citizenship in Singapore. And now young families actually plan their future life with reference to buying a HDB flat, buying a public housing flat. So the joke is that men don't propose to women. The way they propose to women is to say, let's go and book for a flat. And that is the way they propose. Because you have to be, in order to apply for a flat, because of the pro-family policy, in order to apply for a flat, you must have a declared partner. You do not have to be married. You only need to express intention to marry. But 6 months after you collected the key to your flat, you have to register your marriage. But there's a long period of waiting time between declaration and actual marriage. In that process, all kinds of things could happen, including the breaking up of the relationship. When that happens, then they have to withdraw their application, or the third person in that relationship, if there was a third person, then the new couple actually continues to own. Okay, so there are, interesting, quirky stories that comes out of that. But the important is, I think the important message is to actually think politically about housing, and not just in terms of economics and welfare. That's what I've saw.
Thank you very much. Brings a whole new meaning to household reproduction. And one thinks of, the differences between, say, classical Athenian democracy, which was based on land ownership and agriculture, and of course owning about 3 to 4 slaves per household, right? And then the differences with modern democracy, and if you want to call it that, in Singapore. But on the concept of agriculture, let's turn to Dr. Sarena for some insights. Please.
Right. Hello, everyone. So first of all, thank you to the organizers for having me here. Secondly, Dr. Chua spoke about housing. I'm going to talk about food. And the first thing I want to do is congratulate all of you, because, it's almost 5:30, but you're all here, so you all deserve an imaginary 5-star stickers. But it also means that you've had lunch. And if you're not on a keto diet, you probably scooped up some rice on your plate. And I would like to think, and my guess is that you scooped that rice and you didn't think twice about that rice. You assume it's going to be there, you knew it was going to be there, and it's there. You scoop it, you enjoyed it, and well, you don't even think about it. You have all the other lao and all the other parts, and you have it, and that's it, right? That's actually, ladies and gentlemen, a real privilege to have, to not worry about your rice. So my job is that for the last 8 years or so, I've been looking into rice, because for your information, the Malaysian paddy and rice industry is one of the most highly regulated industry in Malaysia. And we've done a comparison. It is also one of the most regulated paddy and rice industry in the world for 80 years. So Prof, back to you when you said that interventions and all that should be short. My dad was born in 1942, and I'll give you a bit of a story how it became 80 years. So where we got here was actually in the 1940s, there was the Japanese occupation. Not us, but maybe our grandparents. I don't know if you've heard about this. There was no rice, and they had to eat ubi kayu or cassava. Have you guys heard about this? That created a sense of panic among the policymakers and the ones who govern the country. And they go, oh my God, we need to make sure we secure rice. And from then on, the scar that happened during the Japanese occupation persists, even though times have changed. It's been 80 years. But it is so highly regulated, and what is the objective of regulating? And when I mean by regulate, I mean at every segment of the supply chain, from growing it, from the input, growing it, milling it, wholesaling it, selling it, every single part is controlled. Even moving it across state, you can't. And do you know that you can't even export rice, by the way? And do you know that, there's a couple of things. For example, you can't actually keep a lot of rice in your house. If you have it a few more bags more, the government have every right to confiscate your rice during a darurat, an emergency. That's all in the Act. It's called Act 522, which is a very powerful act. So, so have we been successful, right? So what is the objective of this really strong regulation? Two objectives. The first is to ensure that 32 million people have access and supply to rice that is cheap. Have we achieved that? Actually, guys, we have. The fact that you don't think about it, generally, I'm talking about generally here, we have achieved that, so kudos, right? The second part is to ensure the income of the farmers. That part we failed miserably because most of the paddy farmers in Malaysia are in the bottom 10% or bottom 20% of the country. Now the question comes, do we still need it? It's been 80 years, as old as my dad. Do we still need it? Now let me tell you something. I wrote it down somewhere. In the 1960s, rice comprised 50% of your calorie intake, roughly, just a general. So that means that of your total consumption, daily consumption of chicken, eggs, maybe a bit of milk, some fish, vegetables, rice comprised about 50% in the 1960s. In the 2000s, it is just 25%. It's going down significantly. So rice is still important, it's still a big part of our life and our culture, but our diets have actually diversified. Your grandparents would only have rice, but us, we have pasta, we have rice, we have couscous, we have tabbouleh and all that kind of stuff. So that's one point, right? So the policy is about producing cheap rice in huge quantity, control the price, and at all costs, produce rice so that there's enough supply for the people. We are having that now, but one thing that we need to realize is that Malaysia is now a middle to higher income country. We want to be a developed country, a high income country. The issue of cheap carbohydrate may not be so relevant. It is still important, but issues such as sustainability, pesticides, traceability, farmers' labor rights issue, climate change, those are issues that we as consumers should begin to care about. What about good agricultural practices? I bet a lot of you, when you buy your rice, you don't check the My Gap, right? Do you know there's actually a stamp called good agricultural practices? Please buy them, please check them, by the way. You should support farmers who do conduct good agricultural practices. But anyway, for us to move forward, it's beyond just cheap rice for the whole country, enough supply, quantity. It's now more about quality. But having said that, if I can tell you that everybody knows that strong intervention, government coming in, it reduces competition, we should take it away, we should reduce monopoly of burners and all that. Everybody knows that, right? But why is it not happening? So anyway, just to let you know, I've spent a couple of years, this is the first report on why is it not happening and how regulated the rice industry is. But the answer is, it's not easy to get rid of subsidies and price ceiling. It is political assassination to yourself. No politician, no one wants to be the one taking away price ceiling. So by the way, in case you don't know, cheap rice has a price ceiling in Malaysia, 1 ringgit 80 to 2 ringgit 60, and we enjoy that. But imagine if I pull off, 32 million people will be pretty pissed off, or they'll just be grumbling every day when they buy rice. So it's not easy to execute. Do I also want to be the one taking away subsidies from the poor farmers? Doesn't look good. Because of that, it has persisted for 80 years. So what do we do about it? So that's my job. So then comes the second book, which I just launched, which is how to deal with it. And I'm not going to come in and say, let's do a big change, because maybe the request is too big and it might not happen. So the strategy actually is, how do you put your foot, or in my case, my heels on the door, keep it a bit of an ajar and start the ball rolling. So the strategy, an example in this sector, in agriculture in Malaysia, the strategy is, for your information, the rice industry in Malaysia is actually dual. And a lot of you don't know this. Any Sabahan and Sarawakian here? Oh yes, one at the back, fantastic. Now, do you know that Malaysia's industry, paddy and rice industry, is actually dual? You have the cheap rice, but you also have specialty rice. And a lot of you don't know about this. And can I get our kind friends at the back to show? I just want to hone down on this. For your information, this is rice taken from just one kampong in Sabah, and it is called specialty rice. It is rice that you cannot find in the rest of the world. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the next champagne, the next Parmesan Reggiano, it's the next Darjeeling tea of the world. And that is our treasure. So Dr. Gwani was saying, right, what is it that Malaysia has an advantage of? What is it that we have that we can do? This is our gift, the gift of nature to us. And this is an advantage that we should take action on. So, like I said, the paddy and rice industry has two. The cheap one, which I won't kacau, okay, let it be. They want to regulate, they can regulate. But why don't we carve out for the specialty rice to be liberated? That means they can automatically export. So for your information, there's an act that says you cannot export out rice. If you want to export rice, you need special permission from the Director General. There's a long process. And for your information, you can't even move rice across state for security reason. But if you're talking about specialty rice that is being sold at 20 ringgit in KL, it's not a food security, it's a premium product. So why are you trying to control it like you would control a cheap rice? So what our recommendation is actually is to carve out, it's like a baby step, right? Instead of saying, clear up the whole thing, let's just carve out first for the specialty rice first, but I said first, carve out for the specialty rice and let them go ahead, let the private sector come in, let the farmers do contract farming with the social enterprise, with the, the social enterprise, the NGOs and such forth, brand and market the products right as best as they can and sell it at a premium, and they earn an income from it. Now, for your information, we actually went to Sabah and Sarawak and we interviewed them. And a lot of them want to plant this because it is their identity, it's their soul. It has an anthropological story to it. It's really beautiful. And the thing is, they want to plant it no matter what. So instead of us coming in, right, as what we would do in policy research, and we say, clear up your land and do palm oil because it'll give you more money, or go and study and then go work in the town. I think it's rather patronizing because they want to do what they want to do. I think what we should do as policymakers is allow them to live how they want to live their lives, but live it better. So in this case, what if they can grow this like how did their ancestors grow this, but with the help of social enterprises and companies, they can sell the excess, bring in a lot of money, and they can buy a motorcycle, they can have better education, they can buy books for their family, and it's a win-win situation. So this is my story. Actually, I don't know how long I've been talking. Do I have some time?
4 more minutes.
I got 4 more minutes, but actually I think I'm done. So this is a sectoral example of market intervention for 80 years, and I'm giving an example of how we can try to tease out and try to solve it, but maybe in a measured step, and rather than trying to ask for something that's really huge that's never going to happen. So yeah, that's it from me. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarena. Your little anecdote about cassava makes me think that one area of policy research could be trauma and policy, because the, electricity sector, we have very, very high reserve margins compared to the international benchmarks. Like a reserve margin, how much you burn extra over demand is about 30 to 45%. And then typically you'd probably be looking at 10 to 20%. So we're basically burning fuel that's not being consumed. And that policy, that shibboleth comes from the trauma of the blackouts of the 1980s, right? And it's still with us, right? So in a way, that inefficiency is kind of built in, and it's very, very hard to change. And actually, on that note of trauma, while the audience gets their questions in on Slido, don't forget to put them in. I think we can also perhaps understand and look at national industrial policy strategies as well as a response to trauma. Sometimes it's the trauma of colonialism, right? It's the trauma of trying to establish a sovereign, independent, economically capable country in a region perhaps that is quite heavily militarized, or you may be going through the trauma of war as well, and that also shapes policy. So as a question I'd like to pose to the panel, how does one negotiate letting trauma spur innovation and response without also becoming a trap for future generations? Perhaps Prof. Ye or Dr. Kim?
Okay, I think it's a very, very interesting from a behavioral economics perspective, because this kind of so-called crisis situations actually drive and set the thinking of policymakers. But it's surprising that we have that kind of institutional memory. So I think we need to go back to the actual policies, the enactment itself, to actually address that. So I think that would be a more so-called, because it's already in the legislation, and unless you remove the legislation, policymakers as well as those administrators would not likely, they are very resistant to change, you see. So that's one challenge that we need to overcome, because we need to build in the future to build an adaptive and innovative kind of administrative capabilities and embed that in our civil service.
Chua, you want to say something?
Yeah, I think this sort of rice example is interesting. What a government gave out is very difficult to take back. So the problem with the subsidy of rice, right, is, as you say, if the incumbent government was to actually allow prices to rise rather than keep it in control, there's a risk of high political costs. I mean, we see this in France, right, where Macron trying to raise retirement age by 2 years, and all hell breaks loose. So then the question listening to you is that if you allow the Sabah rice to be exported, you still have to figure out a way of how to jump over to the subsidy side. Do you actually have any suggestion of how this can be done? Obviously, one way is to actually allow it to creep up slowly. Hopefully no one noticed. But, if you were to let it rise from 260 to something like 4 ringgit, you will actually get a very serious headache, right? But if it goes up to 280, maybe no one would notice. And then but it will have to be a really slow process in terms of that intervention, right? But also the important thing is, of course, an interesting issue, is that the control is actually keeping the farmers poor, which is really a disaster in the making in the long run, right? Because you're going to have a serious depletion of farmers, which is just like in Japan, the rural areas are now having serious trouble keeping up production. Right?
Do you want to respond?
What?
Yeah, I'll just quickly answer about the trauma. One thing I've kind of learned is that you will have incidents of shocks, and policymakers will react because we are under pressure to react, and you've got to show that you're doing something. The problem is we always tend to forget to introduce an exit strategy. And I think that's really, 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 really important. Otherwise, it becomes an 80-year burden. So exit strategy. what is an example? For example, during the chicken issue, right? You know, there was some chicken prices went up and then we put a price ceiling. It can be as easy as, okay, if global maize or corn, which is the main feed for chicken, if the global maize corn go below 200 USD per metric ton, we will see price ceiling. So you already at the front indicate that there is an exit plan, there's a change of plan should things or the market change. And I think that's really important. Otherwise, it is open to the mercy of whoever that has to make the decision. So that's one thing. Number two, about the subsidies. Actually, for specialty rice, if you're going to export it out, you don't take subsidy because you won't comply with WTO. And also, there's going to be people arguing, why are we subsidizing the British or the Germans or the Australians who's having our rice? So normally, what will happen is that if you're going to produce specialty rice for export, you don't subsidize. Now, what about the cheap rice, right? How do you get rid of it? One way, actually, I personally don't like to peel off the Band-Aid really fast kind of person because I think that it hurts. And when it hurts the poorest the most. So if we get rid of subsidies suddenly, we are going to be okay, but not the guys in Kedah and Perlis. So one way actually is to shift, and this is what we're talking about, from input subsidy to output subsidy. What does it mean? You give the same amount, but instead of input, which means we give you fertilizer, we give you fertilizer and pesticide subsidized, what's going to happen is we're going to give you subsidies based on how much you produce. So there is an incentive to be more productive. Another thing that's happening is slowly creeping out the subsidy, which is already happening. Not to a point where you can really feel it, but it's happening slowly and slowly. And I am actually seeing it in the annual budget every year.
Okay, great. So these kinds of output subsidies were also used in South Korea during its industrialization process, right? So if the companies that enjoyed government support at some point hit certain levels of targets for exports, then they qualified for support, yes, rather than sort of feeding the weak. Is that the case, Dr. Kim? And how did they, is it still in place or did they move beyond it?
Same thing happened in Korea, but personally, in my opinion, like, for example, in Korea, we do have a very good policies for the SME, small and medium-sized enterprises. And ironically, there is a Peter Pan syndrome, which means the small and medium-sized companies do not want to grow because they just stay the SMEs and then they get huge benefits. Then those policies are good for our companies? I don't know. Then maybe the most appropriate policy is supposed to be the appropriate time period. I think for certain time period after that, maybe slightly we need to cut. Other than that, then maybe just like a lot of Peter Pans in industries. It's the same thing in certain sectors, like, I don't know, maybe I would say artificial intelligence or big data and those kind of new industry sectors. Government try to subsidize a lot, but then there is no incentive to develop by themselves. So ironically, again, 1998, we do have a financial crisis. It was a crisis, but it has become to an opportunity to change our industrial bodies and structures, and it was a really good chance. But by ourselves, we couldn't do that. It was an exterior shock. So I don't know what is the best policies, what is the best engagement by government.
So what would while I ask this question, do get in questions on Slido. I don't appear to see any so far, but I'll just follow up. So you mentioned earlier the CHIPS Act and then the Inflation Reduction Act from the US. Now they're causing a kind of crisis and shock, right? They're being very disruptive. The Europeans are also complaining about it. They don't like the fact that the US is basically throwing the WTO to the winds and saying, let's just do old school industrial policy and subsidize industry. How do you think Korea is going to respond to that?
It is really tough, but I'm in the public sector, I'm in the public side. So I'm just thinking that Samsung is going to survive or not. Yes, of course. A lot of people, experts, even entrepreneurs, they just all agree that Samsung will survive. LG, yes, will survive. What about SK Hynix? Yeah, Hyundai Automobiles? Absolutely. But what we are afraid is, like in Korean Peninsula, are we gonna have key supply chains or key value chain enterprises or not? Probably not. Samsung invested in China. Samsung invested a huge amount of monies in United States. Same thing happened to the Hyundai Automobile too. So at this moment, the most important thing is in Korean Peninsula, for the Korean people, do we have a really important key value chain sectors or not? How can we attract those kind of things? Absolutely, we need to improve our industrial environments, not just trying to subsidize. Subsidy is no good. I mean, it's very limited. For example, like for the global comparative companies, like we are going to give you free land free. Are you going to just come to Korea? They don't say no. They say no, not at all. There is no market over there. We are not just seeking the rent seeking. They not rent seeking. The most important thing is what is your industrial environments? Is it friendly to the company or not? Those kind of things are much more important. So that's what Koreans industrial policymakers are focusing on these days.
Thank you. So we've got two questions quite closely related on agriculture and food security for Sarena. Would you like to take them? You can combine them, right?
Yeah, so the first one, I will focus on industrialization resulted in a lack of agriculture. Okay, so I'm a bit of an optimist, but I've noticed an observation here about the cycle of countries, okay, or I don't know however you want to say it, but you have a country that started off with low quality agriculture, it becomes manufacturing, then it becomes services, and they stay in services. But in developed countries, even though they have services and agriculture comprise a small contribution, but whatever agriculture that they do is of really, really high quality, high tech, and a lot of effort has been put into it. And there's a lot of interest and pride into it. So for example, if you go to France, if you go to New Zealand, Australia, UK, you have a lot of these local farmers where they have their own produce. They call it organic, they call it sustainable, and they make jams out of it, they make cheese out of it. And it's not something to export to the whole world, but it's a lot of value to the local communities. So I foresee Malaysia, when we come full circle, is that we will begin to appreciate agriculture more, and we will have more of these pockets of professionals who want to go back to their hometown and they want to grow coffee. Like the guy, can't remember in Janda Baik, there's a coffee maker. What's it called?
Pinto
Bean, right? They grow their own coffee beans and they sell it as artisanal coffee. There's a lot of that happening. There's one in Kuantan, there's one in Perak, and I foresee more and more of these kind of pockets of producers happening in Malaysia. Now, talking about being attractive, I really applaud the growth of urban farming, which actually really boomed during COVID. Not because it will be able to feed the whole country. Now, let's be realistic about it. Urban farming, there's only so much you can grow. You can't grow durian, you can't grow paddy, you can grow salad, right? But urban farming has been really fantastic in educating the young and inspiring the younger generation about food and agriculture. And they will be the future growers, and they will be the one who will go out there and be really proud about growing their food and having a production line that is of MyGap, good agricultural practices. So I do foresee things such as urban farming and organic farming. Even though it's niche, people can say it's not going to serve the country, but it has a very good platform for kids. And you guys know Kebun Bangsa, Kebun Sri Atamas. How many kids go there now in the urban areas? I didn't get that chance when I was growing up in PJ. So that is one example. The other one is on self-sufficiency.
Gotta wrap up. Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry, I've just been told we had a minute left a minute ago, so we have to bring this session and day one to a close. Thank you so much for all your questions. If you want, you can try and intercept our panelists on the way out, but I think I have to do some handing over of gifts. Tamina?
That's right. Thank you. Thank you so very much, Shao Loong. And on that note, of course, can I just request for a big round of applause for our final and fantastic panel, rounding out day one of Malaysia Futures 2023. Can we now have the token handover by Shao Loong to each and every one of our panelists? So once again, just going through the set list of our panelists from start to top, there's of course Professor Dr. Kim Leng, there's Dr. Kim Dong-soo, we also have Professor Dr. Chua Beng Huat, and of course Dr. Sarena Cheah Omar.
Thank you. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you very much. May I also kindly ask for all of you to come towards the front of the stage so we can get a quick group photo with all of you, panelists and moderator. Thank you very much once again, Shao Loong and esteemed panelists.